Today we're going to finish the book of Kings, and let's talk about, today we're going to talk about that punishment that we finished on Monday talking about, and that was the punishment that God was going to take the 10 tribes away from Solomon and leave him with one tribe. So let me set this up by thinking about an event in our past as Americans, and that is the Civil War. So if you think about the Civil War, those of you who are native Missourians might know that Missouri was a border state. So think about had the Civil War ended, some of you might shout and jump up and holler here, with the South seceding from the Union. Think about how much different life would be right now for us, for all of us, right? Could you imagine, depending on which way Missouri fell, if you went to Arkansas having to cross through a checkpoint because you were going into a different country? Or if it went the other way, could you imagine having to cross into Illinois by going through a checkpoint, right, because you were crossing into a different country? I mean, just think about how much different life would have been. Literally, the states had been divided back in the 1860s during the Civil War. Right now, you can drive from thousands of miles east to west and north to south and never cross the border, which is pretty amazing. But it would have been much different. So what we're going to see today is how something similar happened in Israel that created a divided kingdom, which really changed how everything worked in their nation. So let's talk about that. This was prophesied, again, to Solomon in the punishment. But when we leave Solomon's reign, we get to what's called the divided kingdom. Now, God in his sovereignty allowed Solomon to have a stubborn son. Might be the way to put this. So Solomon's son was named Rehoboam, okay? Hang on, because the names are going to get really confusing here. And what happened is there was another guy that God raised up named Jeroboam. And so basically Jeroboam and the northern tribes came to Solomon and asked him to lighten the burden that their father had put on their backs. So again, another hint at kind of Solomon's reign. Although his borders were extended and he was a wise guy, the people felt oppressed. They felt overloaded with burden because of how many building projects he did and how, like Samuel told them initially, that he would take their sons and their daughters as slaves and stuff, so forth, so on. So Solomon had put burdens on the people, and they said, hey, come lighten the load your father has put on us. And Rehoboam goes and asks advice from the elders who served his father, and they said, you better listen to him. But then he went to his buddies, and they said, no, tell them you're going to increase their load. So he follows the advice of his buddies. He goes back to Jeroboam and tells Jeroboam, hey, sorry, but I'm going to increase your load. I'm not doing this. So Jeroboam tells him, adios, I'm starting my own kingdom. So this is the big split, the big divide. So we get what's called the divided kingdom, and the reason this is important to know is because at this point, the name Israel can become confusing for you if you don't know how this changed. The referent, so a referent is like the person to whom the name refers, right? So at this point, up to this point in the story, if I said Israel, you would think of the whole nation, all 12 tribes. But beginning in 1 Kings chapter 12, Israel becomes a designation for the northern kingdom. Okay? And Jeroboam is the king of the northern kingdom. So that's why I have Jeroboam in parentheses. So Jeroboam tells Rehoboam he can have it. He's going to start his own kingdom. So Jeroboam takes the 10 northern tribes and he becomes known as the nation of Israel. And then the southern kingdom, which is where Rehoboam reigns, is called Judah, because it's the tribe of Judah. And by the way, you might have noticed as I'm saying this, we keep going 10 and 1. The Benjaminites actually are included in the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Not ask you a question. Tell you why this is important to know. In this section of Kings, 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17, it gets really confusing because instead of the author of Kings telling us the story of Israel and then the story of Judah, he tells them at the same time. So what happens is you're constantly going back and forth between Israel and Judah and focusing on kings, many of whom, by the way, have very similar names. So it can get really confusing. So in fact, it's oftentimes very helpful to, like, if you got the ESV Study Bible, ESV Study Bible has a list of the kings that you can kind of follow and pay attention to which kingdom you're doing. So that's where this gets confusing. So Israel's the northern kingdom, Judah's the southern kingdom. Can anybody tell me what the capital of the northern kingdom eventually becomes? Yes, Samaria. Is that what you said? Yes, Samaria becomes kind of the capital of the northern kingdom. And then the capital of the southern kingdom is, this one should be easy, David's city, Jerusalem. Okay? So just keep that in mind. We got Jerusalem and Samaria as the kingdoms. All right, now, let me just, Jeroboam, let's think of this. So here's the problem. Let's just again go from the Civil War. Let's take the Civil War. The South had succeeded and was able to secede from the Union. Let's just say that happened. The South would have already had set up a capital in the South, right? They didn't want to leave their capital in the Northern Territory, in the North. Why? And you have the potential for the North winning over allegiance if your people are having to go there, right? It's a little different because in Israel, they had this thing called the temple. And the temple was located in Jerusalem. So Jeroboam breaks away, but he realizes that if his people want to worship at the temple, they're basically going into enemy territory. They're going into the southern kingdom of Judah. So what do you think Jeroboam has to do? He has to create a place where his people can go worship. So like any smart person, like anybody who's got any sense and knew anything about Israel's history, Jeroboam decides the best way to do this is actually not to build just one, but to build 2 golden calves. Yeah. Oh my goodness is right. Because Jeroboam builds 2 golden calves, and he puts one in the very northern part of his kingdom and one at the very southern part of his kingdom, so that to make it really convenient, right? I mean, it's kind of like McDonald's, have it your way. He wanted his people to be able to have it their way as far as how they worshiped Yahweh. He wanted one in the south, one in the north. In the south in particular, because that way they didn't have to go down into Jerusalem to worship Yahweh. Now, 1 Kings 12:28, this is what Jeroboam tells them when he builds the golden calves. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Does anybody remember this phrase? Yeah. It was in Exodus when Aaron built the first golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai. Here's exactly what he said to people. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. At which point we're all asking, are you an idiot, Jeroboam? Do you not remember the story of the golden calf and what happened after that? So Jeroboam builds these 2 golden calves for his people to worship. So this, by the way, should signal to us how things are going to actually go for the northern kingdom. And that would be not very good. And if that's your signal, then you're exactly correct. Now, let me show you a couple of things real quick on this. So here's a map of the divided kingdom. So you can see here's Judah, all the region in the south, and there's Jerusalem. Okay, here's the northern kingdom. You see these 2 red altars right here? These are where Jeroboam set up the 2 golden calves. So one is in the south at Bethel, and you can see it's right there on the border. And the second one is in the very, very north, as far north as you can go before you get to Syria, and that's in Dan. Okay. Now, here's a really cool thing. Archaeologists, like Tel Dan is one of my favorite places to go in Israel. It's beautiful up in the northern part of Israel. And archaeologists have actually excavated the site of Jeroboam's golden calf in Dan. So let me show you a picture. So this is what it looked like in Dan at the golden calf. Okay. So if you can look right down here at the bottom, you see this metal frame right there. Do y'all see that? With the 4 kind of projectiles coming on the altar. Those are called the horns of the altar. And they actually found an altar that size. That's pretty massive, by the way. Right there, that was made out of stone. So it was all destroyed. So they just put a metal frame up to represent where the altar was. But if you notice, you got this area, and then you walk up the steps here, and up here is where the actual golden calf would have been. Okay? So the golden calf, they would have come in kind of from this area, and they would have come up, and then they would have gone to worship the golden calf up here. Which, by the way, take a wild guess at which way this faces. East, right? So, and then over here, there would have been like priestly quarters where they would have been like burning incense and stuff like that. So here's what I want you to picture the temple that we looked at on what day? Oh, Monday. And then think about this. What do you notice? What's Jeroboam trying to do by the design of this? He's trying to mimic the temple. Yeah, he's basically building a replacement worship site that is mimicked, is patterned after the temple to get there. So this is pretty cool that archaeologists have discovered this, but that's what you get there in Tel Dan. So now let's move in and think about, here's your timeline, by the way. This is on Campus Web, so don't try to necessarily write it, but this happens at 930 BC. So you remember our Exodus, this is at least 500 years after the Exodus, to give you an idea of how much time's taken place here. So again, the only reason I'm doing the timeline is not because I want you to have a running catalog of dates, but just so you can get a kind of an idea of how much time is passing between these major events in the history of Israel. So what I want to do now is I'm not going to walk through all the individual kings. I mean, it's already hard to stay awake in this room. So I'm not going to walk through all the individual kings. But I do want to talk about real quick how the book of Kings evaluates the kings. Now, we are extremely accustomed to rating almost everything we do, right? I mean, if you go to the doctor, you get a survey afterwards saying, please rate us on how we did. If you go to a restaurant, you get a survey at the bottom of your seat, and they say, please rate us, please give out the survey. If you go to Walmart, if you go to Target, if you go anywhere, if you go here, yeah, there you go. They even ask you guys to do this. I mean, everywhere you're going, people are asking you to rate their service, to rate whatever, right? And even if you go, and this is helpful for us in some ways, right? If you go on Amazon to buy something, if you're smart, what you do is if there's 5 products up there, and one has a 2 stars, and they have 100 reviews, and another one has 4 stars, but they have 1,000 reviews, hopefully you go with the one with 4 stars, right? So we even use ratings to shop. We use ratings to decide what movies we want, right? So if you go to IMDb, or if you go on Netflix or anywhere, you're going to have a rating, or Amazon Prime, they're going to give you a rating for the movie. And if it's a really low rating, unless you're extremely bored, you probably won't watch that movie. But if it's a really good rated movie, you're more inclined to watch the movie. So ratings help us. But with all things, we have certain criteria. So for example, if you go stay at a hotel and they ask you to rate, they'll ask you to give a rating on guest services. They'll ask you to give a rating on the cleanliness. They'll ask you to give a rating on amenities. If they have a breakfast, they'll ask you to give a rating on breakfast. There's all these categories. So here's the deal. Throughout the biblical story, and in the book of Kings, the author of Kings actually starts evaluating the kings for us. In other words, in the book of Kings, there's a rating system for the kings where the kings can be rated. Now, however, the rating system isn't always what we think it is, okay? And oftentimes the kings are rated on many things, but there's a couple of things that unite all the kings. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about the rating system for the kings of Israel. So in the northern kingdom, all the kings of the northern kingdom, which there are a bunch of them, they are rated based on, here you go. This is not going to come as a surprise for you. They're rated based on what they do with Jeroboam's golden calves. In other words, they're rated on basically if they continue to lead the northern kingdom in the worship at the cultic centers, at the worship centers at the golden calves. That's what they're evaluated on. So let me give you an example. Like in 1 Kings 12, right after the divided kingdom, I'm sorry, not 1 Kings 12, 1 Kings 15, it's a common description of the kings of Israel. Say this: he walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin, he made Israel to sin. You hear? So basically, they're not saying the golden calf, but they're saying he caused Israel to walk in the sin which Jeroboam made Israel to sin, is what he does, okay? Now, here's a question for you. How many of the kings of Israel continued in Jeroboam's golden calves? Or we can ask the reverse. How many didn't continue in Jeroboam's golden calves? All of the kings in the northern kingdom kept worshiping at the side of the golden calf. So in other words, all of the kings were bad kings in the northern kingdom. There was one kind of king that looked like he was going to be okay. And if you watch the Bible Project, does anybody remember what that guy's name was? His name was Jehu. Have you heard of this? And basically, Jehu went on he went like a mad hitman. I mean, he just took out anybody that even had any connections to Ahab. He just was a killing machine. He was killing all of Ahab's family. But even Jehu continued in the sin of the golden calves. Okay? Now, let's switch and talk about how the author evaluated the kings of Judah. Now, first of all, we might say that the kings of Judah could, one way to go, and many are, compared to which important figure? Who is the outstanding example of a king in Judah? David, yes. Many of the kings are compared to David. But there's another way that the author evaluates the kings of Judah. And that is actually through something I mentioned on Monday about Solomon. And that is, they were evaluated oftentimes on the basis of the high places. Does anybody know what the high places are? Okay, the temple was built at the site of a high place. But what a high place was is that the Canaanites would oftentimes set up worship sites on top of hills and mountains, and they would worship on the top of the mountains. And this would get them closer to God. They also believed that the mountains were the abodes of the gods. And so the high places, they had multiple worship sites all around Canaan. Well, God told them in Deuteronomy 12 that once they got into the land of Canaan, they were supposed to wipe out, to destroy all the high places. And they were not to worship Him at the Canaanite high places. So here's the deal. Even though they were worshiping Yahweh, He told them not to do it at the high places because it was like how the Canaanites worshiped their gods. So, in the southern kingdom, there were actually a handful of good kings. So it wasn't all bad like the northern kingdom. But there were only 2 kings out of all the southern kings who I just told you the answer I was about to ask you. Who tore down the high places. And those 2 guys we'll talk about a little later. So for instance, they have kings that are saying, basically, he walked in the ways of David, his father, and then it will say, except he did not tear down the high places. So it's like many of them are good, not many, a few of them are good, but there's always this caveat at the end of their reign that they didn't tear down the high places. But there are 2 that we're going to talk about a little later who did. Now, let's move to kind of the other big focus on in the book, and that is the focus on the prophets. So again, there are 2 prophets in Kings. Again, at the end of 1 Kings and at the beginning of 2 Kings, kind of that middle portion of the book, that get lots of camera time. And their names are actually very similar, so you guys could probably tell me who are these 2 kind of prophets. Elijah and Elisha. Elijah and Elisha, okay? So let's talk first about Elijah, and there's a lot we can say about Elijah. In fact, Elijah is mentioned in the New Testament. Who is referred to as Elijah in the New Testament? He was kind of a wild man who liked to eat locusts and honey in the desert. John the Baptist. John the Baptist, Jesus says he's Elijah to come, which is pulling out of a prophecy out of Malachi. But Elijah is an important prophet, but perhaps the most important aspect of Elijah is Elijah has constant friction with what king in Israel? I'll give you a hint. His wife is notorious. Like her name? Yes, Ahab. So Elijah has constant friction with Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Right? Jezebel is a household name even in our biblically illiterate culture. Everybody kind of knows the name Jezebel. But Jezebel was a Phoenician princess who Ahab married, and in Phoenicia she brought in full blast the worship of Baal. Okay? Now Baal worship, under Ahab and under Jezebel, Baal worship became the official religion of the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay? So they not only kept the golden calves, but they also incorporated Baal worship. And they worship Baal significantly. And it all kind of comes to a head. If you remember the story of Elijah, maybe you don't, because I don't think I have you read much of this. Elijah pronounces a drought on the land, which is a direct assault on Baal. Because you remember Baal is the what god in Canaanite mythology? He's the storm god and the fertility god. So he's in charge of producing storms that then water the grass and make the crops grow. And so Elijah steps on the scene and says there's going to be a famine, a drought in the land, and sure enough, there wasn't any rain for a long period of time. And this all culminates, though, when Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown on Mount Carmel. And this is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. So anybody want to tell me what happens? What was the kind of proof of who was God? That's right. The God who showed up by fire. So whatever God consumed the sacrifice from heaven showed up by fire, right? Yeah, and this is where if you like sarcasm, Elijah's your man, okay? Because Elijah is like, he just sits there and watches the prophets. The prophets of Baal start, they cry out all day. They start cutting themselves and doing all these weird rituals, and Elijah's just up there mocking them, like, hey, maybe Baal's up there sleeping or using the bathroom or something, right? They're just mocking them. And then after all that, there's silence. Baal never answers. And so if you remember Elijah, they basically soak the altar and dig a trench around it, and it fills it up with water just to show. And then God answers by fire from heaven and consumes the altar and the sacrifice. And then this is at Mount. If you go to Israel Day and go to the traditional location of Mount Carmel, this is a statue there. This is Elijah here with a sword, and this is a prophet of Baal under him. Because what happened is when that happened, basically Elijah exhorted all Israel to basically kill the prophets of Baal. That's how serious idolatry was. Oops, sorry, I hit the button. And so they kill the prophets of Baal. And so again, here's the deal. This parallels Egypt. Right? Remember in Egypt, Yahweh demonstrated his superiority over Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. And here we see Yahweh demonstrates his superiority over the Canaanite god of Baal. And it basically shows Israel, his people, that he is the one true God. And so Elijah calls them to worship Yahweh. So that's Elijah. Right after Elijah comes another prophet who is known, whose name's very similar, who is Elisha. Elijah started kind of mentoring, so to speak, Elisha at the end of his reign. And Elisha had asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And if you remember, he said, well, if you see me depart, then you can have it. And so if you remember, Elijah is taken up in heaven with chariots of fire. And Elisha sees it, and it appears that he did receive a double portion, because if you were to count up the miracles they did, Elisha does twice as many miracles as Elijah in the book of Kings. And so Elisha, here's his claim to fame. He was a miracle-working machine. I mean, the pages are so full of miracles. In fact, there's an Old Testament scholar by the name of Gerhard von Rad. He's no longer with us, but he's a famous Old Testament scholar, and he said, never in the Bible, in a space so small, have there been packed so many miracles as we get in the Elisha story. Now, he does a lot of cool miracles, but my favorite, this might sound demented, right? But my favorite miracle that he does, and some of you have heard this, is when these little punk teenagers start making fun of his bald head. Y'all know what I'm talking about? And so Elisha just says, all right, you're going down. So he calls some she-bears out of the woods, and they come and attack the little teenage punks. And they don't call him a bald head anymore. So that's Elisha. So that's just kind of stuff he does. He's kind of a cool guy. So, but literally when Elisha was around, everybody pulled out their cell phone to try to catch a video, because he was just like, everything he did was miracle, miracle, miracle. All right, that's Elijah and Elisha. But they dominate the story, and they're also give us a really good glimpse, really, of the first in the Bible really extended focus on a prophet, except for Moses. So after Moses, these two give us an extended focus on that as well. Remember, the divided kingdom was from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 17. And so what happens next in 2 Kings 17 is the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel. So Israel was defeated by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The Assyrians actually laid siege to the city of Samaria for 3 years. It was a 3-year siege. Remember I told you about siege warfare in the ancient world? When you had a fortified city, oftentimes the only way for the enemy to beat you was to surround the city, cut off your supply lines, and then starve you out, and then basically take what's called battering rams and siege ramps. They would build a big ramp up to your wall, and they would just keep ramming your wall until they breached the wall, which could take a long time. And that's how the Assyrians beat Assyria. So at this time in the ancient Near East, Assyria became a superpower. So they control like all of the Middle East. I'm going to show you a map in just a second. Assyria was a superpower. And so they marched down in and they took Israel into captivity. And here's in 2 Kings 17 what it says. Therefore Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and he removed them out of his sight. So go to Von Roberts. Here is the northern kingdom being removed from God's place. And it says, none was left but the tribe of Judah only. 2 Kings 17, 18. And that chapter goes on to say that even Judah was disobeying, and we're about to see the result of that. Okay? Now let me show you a map, because this is going to help us actually as we prepare for the New Testament. Here's a map of the northern kingdom's exile. So if you see, do you see this solid line? The solid line goes all the way from Samaria all through kind of the Fertile Crescent, this area. And the solid line represents the people they took out of Israel. But the dotted line, if you notice there's a dotted line going in, that represents people that the Assyrians brought into Israel. So this is very helpful. Assyria's policy when they conquered a people was to take part of the population out and then bring other foreigners in to that area. Why would they do that? It destroys the culture, and it also destroys any national identity, so that they're mixing the peoples, and it prevents revolts. It prevents a unified kind of revolt against the Assyrians. And this really sets us up for the New Testament, because what happened is the people who were left in the region of Samaria began to intermarry with these foreigners who were brought in, and therefore we get a group of people that we meet in the New Testament, and that would be the Samaritans. Thank you. And how did the Jews feel about the Samaritans in the New Testament? They hated them. Why? Because they said they were a bunch of half-breeds, which they were. They had intermarried with these people who they had brought back to the land. So bottom line is the hatred that we see in the New Testament between the Jews and Samaritans goes all the way back to here with Assyria and how they treated their conquered peoples. Israel's now gone, so all we have left is, here's your exile. I've already told you this date, 722. So just know that's another date. So you can see we're up to 1, 2, 3, 4. I think you have 2 more dates. So you have 6 total for your next exam. So let's go and talk about the final days of Judah. So the last part of Kings, Israel's gone, adios amigos, and then all we have left is the tribe of Judah. And what I want to do is focus on, there are 3 important kings that we get, that the Bible focuses on in these last days of the kingdom of Judah. And the reason, here's what I want to highlight. The reason I highlight these 3 kings is because for all 3 kings, the biblical text tells us that in a certain way, there was no other king like them. Everybody got that? So there's a phrase, there was no one like him in a certain way, and I'll tell you that certain way as we go through them, okay? So let's talk about the first one. The first king was a guy by the name of Hezekiah. And this is in 2 Kings 18 through 20. And I have a verse right here. So we ask, what set him apart? And here's what happened. It said, he trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. So how is Hezekiah unique, and why is he important? Because he trusted in Yahweh like no other king. So his trust in Yahweh is what sets him apart. Okay, so hopefully you've read this story. If you haven't, you'll read it before your quiz on Friday. But does anybody remember how one of the key events that involved the Assyrians, it shows how Hezekiah trusted in Yahweh? So Hezekiah, the Assyrians surround the city and threaten to take the city of Jerusalem. And Hezekiah prays to Yahweh, which here's the important thing. What would have been his other option? So that demonstrated he trusted in Yahweh, because when he was surrounded, he went to Yahweh. But if you know much about the Bible, other kings did something much differently. Does anybody know what his other option was? Okay, he could have tried to fight, but usually if he had tried to fight, he would have sought help from another country. And if Assyria's coming from the north, you know what other country he would have been tempted to seek help from? Egypt in the south. And so Hezekiah doesn't turn to another great nation for help. He turns to Yahweh, and the angel of the Lord comes through at night and destroys 180,000 of the Assyrian army, and they hightail it back to Assyria, and the city is spared. Okay. Now there's another smaller event after that where Isaiah comes. Isaiah is the prophet that interacts with Hezekiah. Isaiah comes and says, "Get ready, you're about to die." And Hezekiah asks for a life extension, and God gives him an extension on his life of 15 years. Pretty cool, right? That would be pretty nice, right? If you're like, oh, I'm about to die, God can have an extension. And God did so because of his faithfulness and his trust in him. So Hezekiah trusted in Yahweh like no other king. And here's the deal. He is one of the 2 kings who removed the high places. So Hezekiah tore down the high places and reformed the people, and therefore was a really good, really important king in Israel. However, his son was not so much. So our second important king is a guy by the name of Manasseh. And if Hezekiah was one of the best kings, his son Manasseh was one of the worst kings. So here's what the text says about Manasseh. This is his uniqueness. This is what sets him apart from all the kings. It says, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and has done things more evil than all the Amorites did who were before him. And he has made Judah also to sin with his idols. So in other words, this passage says that Manasseh actually outdid the Canaanites and the Amorites who were in the land before him. And if you remember, what's the one sin we highlighted when we talked about the destruction of the Canaanites as to why God said, I'm judging them? Idols, and in particular, they worship one idol that involved what? Child sacrifice. And guess what? Manasseh did the same thing. So Manasseh, let me just tell you a few things Manasseh did. He set up idols in the temple. That's where we get with his idols. I mean, he just undid everything Hezekiah did. He set up idols in the temple. He caused idolatry across the land. And then he began to practice child sacrifice by sacrificing his sons to the fire, to the god Molech. Now here's the deal. With Manasseh, God says, I'm done. Manasseh was the straw that broke the camel's back. Manasseh is where God says, I'm done with Judah. I'm going to send them in exile. There's no more chances, okay, after Manasseh, which is rather ironic because our next king is arguably the best king in the history of Judah, perhaps even including David, and that's a big statement. Does anybody know who this next king is? He was the best king, particularly in the book of Kings, Josiah. Josiah, 2 Kings 22:23. So if you want to understand what that Deuteronomy passage I read the other day, the laws for the kings, if you want to see that in action, just read the story of Josiah. He is the perfect model of Deuteronomy 17 and the type of king God desired to have. So here's what it says about Josiah. Before him there was no king like him who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might. Recognize the Deuteronomy language? According to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So what's his claim to fame? What makes him unique? Is his repentance and his reform of the nation. So what sets Josiah apart is he reformed the nation of Judah like no other king. He cleaned house. Okay? In particular, there was a priest who found the book of the law in the temple, and if you find something, that means it was what? Before? Lost. He found it, and he reformed the nation. I mean, he took out all idolatry, reformed the temple, and even went up to Bethel, which was in the northern kingdom originally, and he cleaned house there, that worship site in Bethel. So Josiah is really important king. However, because Yahweh had already said, I'm done with you, even Josiah's reforms could not stay or hold off the wrath that God had intended. So I must admit, I'm kind of a 90s country fan. That's true country. The junk today, I don't know what that is. But anyway, so in the 90s, maybe 80s, Tanya Tucker, anybody heard of Tanya Tucker? She had this country song called It's a Little Too Late to Do the Right Thing Now. Anybody heard of that? That's Josiah. He did the right thing, but it's just too late. Not because of him, but because of Manasseh. Okay? So then what happens next is exactly what we would expect, and that is Judah is taken into exile. The Babylonians destroy Jerusalem in 586 BC. 586 BC, the Babylonians lay a 2-year siege on the city of Jerusalem. And again, because it's siege warfare, it gets very nasty. And if you want to read how nasty it is, the best book you can read is the book of Lamentations. It's very vivid and very awful, some of the things that happened in the siege of that city. But finally, the city was breached, the walls were breached, and they were taken into exile. Okay? Now, let me just show you real quick a map. If you notice on this map, there's no dotted line. The Babylonians didn't practice the same policies as the Assyrians, so they took Judah, the inhabitants in Jerusalem, really all the way over to Babylon in Mesopotamia, and that's where they stayed for a few years, and on Friday we get to see them come back on that. All right, I got 2 more slides, I'll let you guys go. Here's your date. You got this on your map. I already told you, 586. The last thing I want to talk about, the last minute and a half, is this. The book doesn't end with exile. It does. It ends with exile, but there's this really little story at the end. Remember, the ending of books are really important. And the ending of Kings is extremely important because you get this glimmer of hope. And so I'll just tell you real quick the story, and then you guys, I'll tell you what's a glimmer of hope. At the end of the book, the Davidic king, who was one of the Davidic kings who was taken into exile in the Babylon, Davidic descendants, who was taken into exile was a guy named Jehoiakim. And he, at the end of the book, just has this little story that says he was exalted in Babylon and changed clothes. He's taken out of his prison garments, given new clothes. And then he was eating at the king's table. So he had a privileged seat in Babylon. And then the book ends. You're like, oh, wow, that was an interesting little story. Why does the book end that way? Because the book ends that way is because what the author is trying to do is to remind us that even though his people are out of the land, they've been in exile, he's given us a little hint. Hey, but God has not forgotten about his Davidic king. In other words, the Davidic heir who's sitting in Babylon is being treated well. And God is preserving the line of David even while they're in Babylon. And so it reminds us that God is faithful to the promises that he had given Israel in the Davidic covenant. So the book ends by saying, hey, bad news, they're in exile. But hold on just a minute. God is not done working.